expectation over the shifted distribution. Okay.
I'll do it now. If you could move so I can see the moves.
Yes. Now, however, nonetheless, most of the literature in distribution generalization focuses on this worst case approach because most often it's quite relevant in specific application where potential catastrophic consequences might arise from some mistake, okay? And classical example of these are like in medical application first, but possibly one could argue also in self-driving cars where the model is learned on a certain training distribution and deployed on a one that is different. Okay. Now, the literature of distribution generalization is very broad. Here, I'm not trying to be exhaustive, but I just want to recap different line of works. And actually, the line of works differentiate from each other in the way they model this calligraphic set P, so the set of possible shifts. So one very kind of a popular line of work is the one of the covariate shift, where the assumption is that the possible shifted distribution have to obey a certain restriction. And the restriction is that the conditional distribution of y given x remains constant between training and test distribution, okay? Which means that basically what it is allowed to change from training and test is the marginal distribution of x. Okay, this is one line of work. Another line of work models the set of possible shifts by considering as a center the training distribution, the one that we have access to, and then by using a certain distance, it considers a ball around this distribution. Now, a ball around the distribution, of course, it's defined using certain metrics, such as, for example, the Wasserstein distance or the F divergence. And really, then, therefore, this calligraphic P, it's really all distribution, a test set, such that their distance from the training is at most epsilon away. Okay, this is another way that this problem has been tackled. Another one, it's one called maximin effect and worst group robustness, where the idea is that at training time, we have access to a set of training distribution. And the idea here, what does it mean to have more than one? It's really saying, okay, we have data collected from different environments that might be heterogeneous. And then what we expect at test time, it's a distribution that is contained in the convex hull of these. So in other words, we can pick arbitrary mixtures of this training, and we would like to be robust against those, okay? Now, the first question one can ask is, how does causality help in this kind of distribution generalization quest? And really, the main idea is the following. It's by recalling that this calligraphic P denotes the possible distribution that one might observe, and the idea of having a causal model to talk about distribution generalization, it's really to model this class of distribution as distribution generated by some interventions on a certain causal model, okay? Now, one remark over here is the following. So what I'm going to show next, it's really a specific type of model, which for those who might be a bit more familiar with causality, it's quite common. It's a model that arose in economics first. It's an instrumental variable setting. However, I mean, going beyond the model, I think what's interesting is that this causal approach really allows us to study a bit more in detail under which condition of this kind of shifted distribution we can achieve this distribution generalization. Because what happens most often in the literature is to really say, okay, we would like to solve this problem, okay, and then what they go on is to really propose a methodology that it's usually kind of data-driven, and then they assume that what they do, according to some, of course, heuristic rule, achieve this. And this, of course, it's fine, but what we would like to do here is to, of course, be a bit more precise on the data generating process and see where this leads. But of course, this just to highlight that it's by no means the most general setting, but it's just a possible setting that nonetheless it's quite relevant. So here, to zoom a bit, I want just to lay down the setting that we are working with. So for those, again, who are familiar with the instrumental variable setting, this might look very familiar. So what we are dealing with here is a set of 5 variables, 3 of which are observed, so z, x, and y. And the specificity, I would say, of this model is that we have covariates x, response y, and the set of exogenous variables z. And the covariates x and the response y are possibly confounded by this latent exogenous variable u and v, okay? So here, to be a bit more precise on the structure we give to this data generating process, so we assume that the u and v, so the latent unobserved confounders, are independent of the exogenous variables. It is something that also in the instrumental variable model, it's assumed. Then we postulate this, in this case, additive, but even more, it's parametric relationship between x and z. So in particular, we assume that z enters in a parametric, in this specific case, linear, enters in a linear fashion into x, and y depends onto x in a nonlinear way, plus some noise that is confounded. So the main difference between the classical instrumental variable setting and what we have here is that we do not assume identifiability of the structural function. In the sense, a classical condition to identify the structural function in the causal literature is to have as many exogenous variables as covariates. Here we do not assume that. And we will see how this lack of identifiability plays with the goal of achieving a function that is robust and predictive. Okay, now given this model, given this model over here, the question is, how can we generate a collection of shifted distributions, okay? And really the idea is the following. So what we observe, we have access to the variable, as I mentioned, z, x, and y, okay? And so the variable x, z, and y have a joint distribution, which in general can be written as the joint of y and x given z times the marginal of z, okay? So far, it's nothing special over here. But now we assume that the distribution that might arise from these models are all possible distribution over x, y, z, when the distribution, the marginal distribution of z is arbitrary distribution, okay? I put arbitrary in quotes because I will try to be a bit more specific on the condition we require, but really the only part that can change in this system, it's really the exogenous variable. Now one can, at least first reaction, at least the one I also had, is okay, just by changing a marginal distribution of the exogenous variable, I mean, it's really a very granular, or if you want, specific change in the whole model. So how does this kind of give a rich set of shifts? But actually, it turns out that by shifting the distribution of z, okay, first of all, the first remark, which is quite obvious, if I shift the distribution in z, since z enters directly into x, well, also the marginal of x will change, okay? However, given that we have this hidden confounding, so it's this, if you want, vector path here, when I condition on x, I have here, I mean, for those who are familiar with graphical models, we have here a collider, but it's not very important. What it matters is that if I condition on this variable, then by changing the distribution of z, I'm going to change also the conditional distribution of y given x through this vector path, which means that the combination of allowing shifting z and confounding really allows for arbitrary shift in both parts of the joint of x and y, because recall x and y, we can always factorize it as the marginal of x times the conditional of y given x, okay? Now here I just want to draw, this is just to give a bit of intuition, how the covariate space and the shifts actually in the covariate space might look like. Because, okay, as you might see here, we have this linear restriction. And so first I want just to give a quick example and then comment on that very briefly. So suppose now that we have a very simple example, so 2 covariates. This M matrix is a vector, 1, 1, this is just an example. The exogenous variable is one-dimensional. And then we have, well, two-dimensional noise, V1, V2. Now, what it means is that the way Z enters the system actually affects X1 and X2 along this direction vector 1, 1. In other words, all possible shifts of Z will kind of propagate into the system along this subspace over here in the predictor space, okay? So this is just the span of this matrix or vector over here. Now, why do we require this parametric form? Okay, strictly speaking, we don't need linearity in Z, so we could also assume that we have a nonlinear transformation of Z, but what we do require in order to get generalization result, as I will show later, we require this relationship, so also possible nonlinearities in Z, to be known. So in a sense, we need a known basis function. And this is really because in a previous project, we were showing some impossibility results from distribution generalization. And one of the impossibility results, which, I mean, it's quite intuitive, it's that if we do not constrain the way the predictor kind of space can be modified, so if it's completely non-parametric, then nothing can be said in distribution generalization. In other words, things can go arbitrarily wrong, and we cannot protect against any type of shift. So even though linearity, it's maybe a bit restrictive, having a parametric model from Z to X, this is required. Okay, please let me know if you have any question, and yeah, I'm happy to take it also during the talk.
Is it because if you take a non-parametric model,
yes,
then phi Z becomes infinite-dimensional, and then it breaks the non-identifiability condition?
Well, this is one of the reasons, but the other reason it's really about what can we say when the distribution of Z at test time falls in a domain, so really in an interval, if you want, that was not observed at training time. So if you are in a sort of extrapolation scenario, and without this sort of and actually even if you stay within support, so even if you don't leave the support, if Z can be completely, the relationship between X and Z is completely non-parametric, then you might observe a Z at test time that were never seen, that has an effect that you cannot really quantify. Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay. So really the goal that we have here is, given the model that I just presented, what we have access at training and we have access to a training distribution and training time, and we assume that both the training and test distribution come from this family of shifts, where the shifts are only generated by shifting the margin of Z, as I discussed before. Therefore, at training time, we observe n independent copies of the random vector X, Y, and Z. So at training time, we have access to all three information, so X, Y, and Z. However, at test time, we assume that while we observe the covariate X, we do not have access to Z, okay? So at test time, we just have X, and we try to, well, predict from X the best prediction possible for Y, okay? One argument of why Z might not be available at test time is in the case where Z is discrete. So if Z is discrete, for example, I collected data from different hospitals, okay, each hospital can be thought as a different categorical Z, but then when I try to make my model work on a new hospital, well, using this new label that was never seen at training time is not really helping me and is not really predictive of what I'm trying to do. So that's one of the motivation of why one might have this, this setup over here. And really the goal, as I mentioned before, it's trying to learn this function f hat that predicts X, Y from X on the worst case shift. So in the following, I will really try to zoom in a bit and trying to see under which condition on this shift distribution we can achieve this objective one when the function class f can be non-parametric under the training support. I will make this a bit more clear later. And the way we are trying to tackle this problem is by the lens of invariance, okay? So invariance-based learning really puts together different line of works that tries to combine distribution generalization and causality. So it's not something new. But what we're trying to do here is to argue that in order to use invariance ideas to achieve distribution generalization, well, one needs some sort of very strong invariant notion that I'm going to present here, okay? So really to first define what we even mean by invariance and invariant function. So consider here we have a function in a function class F and a given distribution P from the set of shifted distribution. So we denote by P1 minus F the residual distribution, okay? And we say that a given function F is invariant if its residual distribution it's constant across all possible shifts, and in particular, if the training distribution belongs to calligraphic P, the function F is invariant if the residual distribution at training time is the same as the residual distribution across all possible shifted distribution. Now, as you might see, this notion is quite strong because in a sense it relates notions from the training distribution to notion on anything else that can happen outside, right? And nonetheless, we try to go on with that. Okay, so this is the way invariant function is defined. Of course, we can collect all functions that satisfy this condition and we can put them in a class. This is what we call the set of invariant functions. And so here, this set of invariant function has a couple of properties I would like to mention. Of course, with respect to the model I just considered. So the first one is the set of invariant function implicitly actually depends on the class of shifts one consider, right? So for example, if I consider, so it's really, if you want, you can think of this as a set that depends on another class of shifts. Now, if I consider as the only possible shifts the training distribution, well, you can see that any function will satisfy this condition, right? Because if, calligraphic P just contains the training distribution, then what we have is that this invariant set, it's, well, the original set to begin with. So in a sense, the size of these shifts really controls in an inverse way the size of this invariant set. So if we have arbitrarily strong shift, then this invariant set will shrink and vice versa. And the other consideration, because this is very important to check, is this set non-empty? And in the model we're considering, it is. In particular, a very kind of straightforward element of this set, it's the structural function F0, okay? But it's not the only one, as we will see. Actually, due to this under-identifiability, we will see that there is kind of a space of function that satisfy this invariant condition, and we will try to find the one that is kind of most predictive. Now, the first remark I want to make is the following. How does this invariant definition and invariant set relate to the goal of distribution generalization we had before? And really, this comes by combining two ideas, which I try to do here. So the first one is the following. The first idea is the following. Given the set of invariant function I, one can really realize that for any function in this invariant set, we have that the mean squared error under the training loss, it's going to be the same as the mean squared error under the training distribution. It's going to be the same as the mean squared error under any other distribution. This is really by this strong invariance definition, okay? Which in turn implies that the loss that we observe at training time is going to be the same as the worst case loss. This is just because for all invariant function, we have this sort of constant behavior across shifted distribution. So this is the first kind of ingredient. Now, the second ingredient is, now suppose if we have that the set of distribution, possible shifted distribution is large enough, well, this, and of course this, so far it's made informal, it means that for every function that is not invariant, we can find a nasty enough distribution so that, well, we can make this non-invariant function perform arbitrarily bad, okay? I think this is very easily explained with a very simple picture, which of course it's very qualitative, but might give some sort of an idea. of this invariance-based approach to achieve distribution generalization. So suppose here we have on the y-axis the mean squared error against a certain distribution P, and here I denote all possible distribution P. Now, an invariant function, we said, will have this property, okay? So if a function, let's say f0, let's say f1, so we don't, f1 is invariant, we'll have the property of having constant risk, okay? Now, if I take instead a non-invariant function, it might be, so behave something like this, okay? So here, again, qualitative picture, we might have, for example, that this non-invariant function under the training distribution, it's behaving much better than the invariant one, okay? And moreover, if the set of possible distribution that we can shift is not large enough, so for example, if you consider a set of this size, calligraphic P0, you will see that, well, the worst case achieved by this non-invariant function is still smaller than what is achieved here, okay? So that is why we argue that if one wants to go along the way of invariance to achieve distribution generalization, it's really needed. Okay, the first condition is invariance gives like constant risk, that's reasonable, but we also need another ingredient, meaning we have to kind of assume that the function class against which we are protecting ourselves is large enough. So for example, if the function class is like this, well, then we can see that in this case, the worst case risk of the non-invariant function will be larger than the one from the invariant class. Okay, so that was just to give a bit of intuition on why this invariant approach might work and under which condition. Now, the first attempt to solve now this problem on how to use invariance to achieve distribution generalization is the following. Okay, what if we try to solve this original problem, which is the distribution generalization problem, by trying instead to solve an optimization problem where, well, we consider first the loss under the training distribution, but on a set of function that is restricted now. So instead of minimizing against the class of all functions that I'm considering, I just restrict only to those functions that are invariant. But the nice thing is that if I can restrict over this set of function, then instead of computing this soup, that it's hard, well, I can just replace this soup by the loss under the training, since for all invariant function, the loss is constant, okay? Now, what is the issue with this kind of very direct approach is that in general, but even not so in general, even in the setting that I showed before, the one that we are considering, so the model that we have the issue that we have to kind of be able to identify. So in order to solve this optimization problem, we need to, in a way, to learn this set first, right? And optimize explicitly over it. And the two difficulties are the following. So the first one, it's really hardness of identifying I. Why is that? Because if you recall, I, it's really the set of all function, say in this class, where the training distribution of the residuals, which is something that we can observe, matches with the residual distribution over all possible functions that might appear at test time, which we don't have access to, okay? So this is the first difficulty. The second difficulty is that in order to, well, perform optimization, one needs to understand how this set looks like, and it's not so trivial to exactly characterize it. So we have some ideas on how this goes even for this specific setting, but still we couldn't fully kind of write down the exact definition. So that's this first attempt is really like not so viable. So that's why there exists also possible solutions, alternative to that, which really try to solve a relaxation to this problem. So instead of solving this optimization problem by searching over exactly or strictly invariant function, they relax, if you want, this set I over a strictly larger set calligraphic H. And in the literature, there exist different proposals, and I'm going from the strongest to the weakest, if you like. So in some line of work, people really try to find the most predictive function over here over the set of functions that enforce independent residuals from the exogenous variable. But of course, enforce this independence under only the training distribution, because that's what we have access to in a sense, right? So this is kind of the first proposal. The second type of relaxation that it's slightly weaker is just to say, okay, instead of enforcing the full independence of the residual, what if we stop at the mean independence? That's another possibility, okay? And the further relaxation is also just to say, okay, instead of considering mean independence, what if we just say, okay, we look for all functions whose residuals are just uncorrelated with Z, okay? And as you can see, these are exactly this condition implies this, implies this. So if a function is in H1, is in H2, and then in H3, okay? Now this idea over here, for example, is very reasonable if the whole model is linear and Gaussian, okay? In that case, it's fine because we know that if everything is Gaussian, uncorrelation equals independence, and that's fine. However, the problem is that all these conditions, even though, I mean, even the most stringent one over here, has the issue that by solving the problem, the relaxed problem might not necessarily yield a solution that is invariant. So for example, in the article, we have counterexample, but the idea is quite simple. It's really saying, since this condition has to hold under the training distribution, it doesn't necessarily have to hold for new distribution because it's an independence condition that, yeah, was really checked in a sense under the training here. So of course, what are the possibilities? So what we propose here, it's in a sense a bit more direct approach that really exploits, as you will see, the structure of the model that we began with, okay? And the approach that we introduced, it's what we call the boosted control function. So we'll try to explain how this name came from, and actually will be quite clear because it's really building upon this control function literature from econometrics. So this literature of control function, for those who are familiar with, again, with the instrumental variable framework, control function approach is really another way of trying to identify and learning the structural function of the model, okay? The other common approach is called the two-stage least squares, okay? And under some condition, these two approaches can be shown to be equivalent, not in the linear setting, however. Now, the idea that we kind of come up with is the following. So the first two steps, it's really exactly what the control function method would propose. And the idea is the following, really exploiting the structure of the model. And I would say the really kind of crucial part, it's the additivity of this equation over here. So let me, okay. By exploiting the additivity between Z and X, what we can do, we can identify, and actually by regressing the vector X onto Z, which is observed, we can identify these control variables V, okay, which are really, can be computed, okay, in population as X minus MZ in finite samples by regressing X onto Z. Now, these variables are called control variables because in a second step, we use them to run an additive regression where we try to learn Y using both X and V. Now, given the definition of Y, which is really additive in X plus U, what we have is the following. Now, if we compute the expectation of Y, given X and V, what we end up, it's really the expectation of F0X plus the expectation of U given X and V. Okay, so the first term, it's quite easy. This is a function of X. And so when I condition on X, the second variable in the conditioning set disappears. Now, regarding the second term over here, this is more interesting and it's really kind of exploiting the additivity in the first term, but I think it's easier to see graphically. So if I have this Z, X, and then, sorry, the V and U relation, here we see that once we condition on V, then all the information of, so actually all the information of U that flows to X is already contained in V. Okay, so as soon as I condition on V, X becomes independent, and in this case also mean independent of U. That's why from this equation, the X disappears. For this reason, we are left then with two functions. This is just, well, the F0 of X function itself, and this is just a function that depends on V. Okay, so it's really an additive regression form. And this is really what we would have with the control function method from econometrics, because it would stop here, because the goal there is to really find a function that it's actually the structural one, the causal one, which is F0. However, here for our purposes, it's to find a function that, well, it's not necessarily the structural one, but it's stable and as predictive as possible. And here is where the boosted part comes in, because the idea is the following. So after having learned this F0 function, we still have, yes?
So is the control function still works even if under unidentifiable conditions?
Well, under non-identifiable condition, that's a very good point. The control function would return a function that is not exactly F0, will be, for example, F0 plus some delta of X. Okay, which can be shown that it can be also expressed as some sort of delta of V that therefore can be subtracted here. So we can always add and subtract a term in the under-identified case that prevents us to exactly learn F0. Now, but let's say that we have already learned this part over here. Now the goal is to say, okay, we still have this term over here that, well, comes from Y, and we would like to predict. So it's something that, if you want, it's left on the plate in terms of signal that we can learn from. And this term actually, it's a term that just depends on V, which means it's really dependent on X. So we can still use X in order to boost over this term and learn from it. But the approach we propose is really to regress, so to learn this remainder function, if you want, not with all X, so as if we would do something like that, but just taking an invariant transformation of X, okay? Where R really here denotes all directions that are invariant. So again, it's quite simple with the picture, so I will try to show it here. So if you look again at the example that I introduced before, so we had, it was a very simple two-dimensional setting. So what we have here, we said that the direction of the shift that we might have are along this span of M, which means really from a, if you want, linear algebra argument, is that over its orthogonal complement, so this is a space, this span, it's a vector space. If we take the orthogonal complement over here, which I denote by a basis R, well then this space, it's actually the space that is invariant to all these shifts, okay? Because it's like perpendicular to it. And the idea is really now to learn what's left just by using the information of X that is in this space over here. Now, the resulting function that we get, it's boosted control because it adds, if you want, to the structural function, this boosted term. And I think it's interesting to compare it to the least square solution. Because now if we compared so if we wanted to instead compute the least square solution, which we know to be the most predictive under the training, so the least square solution really what it does computes the conditional expectation of Y given X, okay? But then if we really exploit the fact that Y it's defined as f of X plus U, we can write this least square function as the structural function plus the expectation under the training distribution of gamma V given X. So you really see that the difference between the least squares and boosted control function, it's really in the added part over here, not to use all the information available from X, but only to kind of to screen out the information that it's kind of not stable and to keep the invariant one, if you like, okay? Now, what can we say about this boosted control function in terms of guarantees? Because at the end of the day, that's what we are trying to do with this very kind of specific model. So the first thing we are trying to say, it's something about identifiability. The idea here, we are not even at a sample level. So we're really saying, suppose we are in a population setting where we have access to the training distribution. So what can we say? Is it possible to learn this function f star from the training distribution? And the answer is yes. Okay, here we propose two sufficient conditions for identifiability. These conditions are conditions that, well, can be checked, cannot be necessarily checked, but they are not so, I would say, unrealistic. But of course, they are not exhaustive. There might be kind of more complicated and realistic one. Here, the idea was really to come up with two concrete examples. One example is a setting where z is a continuous variable, so the exogenous variable is continuous. And here it's a setting where z is discrete. Okay, and under this one of these two conditions, it is possible to learn this boosted control function from the training distribution. And then as a kind of corollary, now if the training distribution spans kind of the whole covariate space, or alternatively, if the function class is such that it's fully non-parametric under the training support, but then we have somehow some sort of extrapolation guarantees. So one example of this function class that is nonlinear on the training and flat outside could be a function class from training decision trees or random forest, where you arbitrarily learn arbitrary complex function on the training data, but then arbitrarily outside of that, you extrapolate arbitrarily far, but in a constant fashion. So if one of these two conditions is satisfied, then we can also learn this boosted control function from the training data, but over all kind of possible shifted distribution. Okay, so that's the first condition, which is quite important because it kind of gives a way to transfer what we learn on the training to what we learn on possible test distribution. And now the first remark I want to make is that, so this boosted control function has the property of being invariant. And the reason being because it's really, if you remember, a sum of the structural function, which we argue it's always invariant, plus some term that uses only the invariant part of x, okay? So this boosted control function is invariant. Now what we would like to check is, okay, being invariant, it means it achieves these strong invariance notions that we proposed in the beginning, but the question is it minimax optimal? So it's also the most predictive one among those invariant ones. And that's what we were able to show, again, under some specific assumption, and this really shows how, like for this distribution generalization guarantees, it's kind of really hard to get away without like enforcing like some very precise condition. And the condition we have here, again, these are possible conditions, I'm not saying that they are the only ones, are the following. So suppose that the function class here, it's a function class such that under the training support, it's non-parametric, but outside we have somehow knowledge of how it extrapolates. And again, the easiest example we came up with was the set of function learned by decision trees or random forest. But now, if the collection of shifted distribution is large enough, and now the arbitrary large that I originally wrote down, here we formalize by saying, okay, the collection of shifts can be arbitrary shifts as long as it contains shifts in the Z distribution that are basically kind of Gaussian distribution on Z where we kind of blow up the variance, okay? And this condition is satisfied, then under, again, two possible conditions of the noise of U and V. Again, this condition were just to have, okay, this one, it was quite classical. That's why it was also like easier to show. This one was actually more involved, but really was to have a case where the noise term is either bounded or unbounded in the support. So under these two, one of these two cases, then it's possible to show that the boosted control function, it's really the one that has the smallest worst case risk under this class of distributions over here. Now, these results kind of shows like a possible solution to the original distribution generalization problem, but also kind of closes the loop in a sense, because if you remember, in the beginning I said one could really try to solve this distribution generalization setting from an invariance perspective by trying to minimize over the set of invariant function, adjust the training risk, okay? And what we argued was that explicitly characterizing and identifying this invariant function was not so trivial. But actually what it turns out is that since the boosted control function is invariant and it's worst case optimal, it's also very easy to show that it's among the invariant function is the most predictive ones, okay? Recalling that the set of invariant function, it's always defined with respect to a certain set of shifts, okay? Now, before wrapping up, I just want to give a qualitative example of how things look like. Okay, this one is really a toy example, but it's just to highlight some of the features that I discussed so far. So what we had here was really joint Gaussian distribution between the noise term U and V and the exogenous variable Z, where we allow Z to possibly kind of grow in the variance term. So this K here, it's really a knob to tune how strong the shift occurs. So at training time, this K is equal to 1. And at test time, we set K larger than 1. Okay, this is like just simple way to simulate shifts in Z. The model is the same as before, where, okay, now the rank of M, so basically, exactly, if you like, you can think of it, how many exogenous variable you have is denoted by Q. And the function class that we consider here is those decision trees because they have this feature of flat extrapolation. Now, what we ran is like a set of simulation where here, so in each panel, the x-axis really denotes this K strength, so how much we are kind of changing the margin of Z. And on the y-axis, we show the test mean squared error for different methods. So here, what we see first is the following. We have two baseline methods. So this one is really just fitting a constant, so just the mean. And this is just a sanity check because with this decision tree thing, since they extrapolate flatly, I mean, just a completely constant function might already work. And this was really to check. And in fact, you can see that just a flat function, it's already not too bad in terms of robustness, because for different perturbation, it's flat. But you can see it's not the most predictive. Now, the other kind of baseline we have, which is again an oracle, in this case, it's the structural function. So this triangle over here, it's really the F0, if you want, function. And then we also have the oracle, if you want, imp, which is the population boosted control function, okay? As you can see, first of all, it's the following. So we try to learn this from data. So the purple line really reflects the boosted control function learned from data. So we have some sort of gap from the population one, okay? And this gap kind of shrinks as we move along this direction. And what is this direction telling us? So here what we fixed, again, as an example, we fixed a setting where we have 10 predictors. And now this denotes the number, if you want, of exogenous variables. Now, we said that when we are in a case where we have as many exogenous variables as predictors, then the structural function, it's identified, okay? Which means here that the best we can do, actually, so in the classical, if you want, instrumental variable setting, the best you can do in terms of robustness predictivity, is to use the structural function. As you will see, the imp, BCF, and structural will match. However, kind of the boosted term on top of F0 turns out to be kind of turns out to help with robust prediction as you move away from identifiability, because here we have these under-identified settings and we see that we start to have a gap from the population boosted control function and the structural one. And the gap is wider, the wider is the space of invariance function over which we can kind of optimize over. And of course, yeah, we have some sort of finite sample error for this. And finally, this yellow curve just denotes the least square solution, which again, unsurprisingly, it's basically the best you would like to do when you have when you expect small perturbations, right? So the least square, it's usually the most predictive, but it has like much worse properties when the test distribution is much farther away from the training one. Okay, so maybe I will wrap things up quickly. So what we looked at together is at the problem of distribution generalization in a specific model where we have a nonlinear and possibly non-identifiable structural function. And now the way we tried to address this distribution generalization task was to relate a very strong invariance notion to previously proposed invariance notions that might be, in some cases, too weak to achieve this distribution generalization. And like in practice, we proposed this approach, boosted control function, that works with flexible non-parametric techniques. And the easiest, like most natural example, it's really by means of random forest or decision trees. Now, if you're interested, you can find our article on arXiv, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.